In western New Mexico, on a stretch of high desert between red sandstone mesas, there is a town where people speak a language that does not match any other language on Earth. Not a distant cousin. Not a divergent branch of some larger family. Nothing. Every other language spoken in the American Southwest belongs to a family. Navajo and Apache belong to the Athabascan family, with relatives stretching all the way up into Alaska and northwestern Canada. Hopi belongs to the Uto-Aztecan family, connected to languages spoken from the Great Basin down into central Mexico. The Karasan and Tanoan languages of the other Pueblo communities have their own internal relationships and long-studied histories. And then there is Zuni. Linguists have spent well over a century attempting to connect it to something, anything. They have compared it to its immediate neighbors, to distant language families across the continent, to proposals linking it to groups in California, in Mexico, and further afield. Every serious attempt has failed to produce the kind of systematic evidence that establishes a genuine relationship. Zuni is what linguists call an isolate, a language with no demonstrated relatives, living or dead. Now, isolates exist. Basque in Europe is the famous one. There are others scattered around the world. They are unusual, but they are not impossible, and the standard explanation is straightforward. A language family can lose every member except one, and after enough time, the surviving language looks unrelated to everything around it because everything it was related to is gone. That explanation is almost certainly the right one in most cases. But in the 1980s, an anthropologist named Nancy Yaw Davis began looking at the Zuni and became convinced that something else was going on. And what she eventually published was one of the most unusual arguments in the history of American anthropology. She proposed that in the 13th century, a group of people crossed the Pacific Ocean from Japan, traveled inland to the American Southwest, and merged with the ancestors of the Zuni people. Today, we're examining the linguistic evidence, the archaeological record, the Zuni's own traditions, and the question of what actually happened in the American Southwest around the year 1275. Because whatever the answer turns out to be, the standard version of the story has some genuine gaps in it. To understand why the Zuni language attracts so much attention, you have to understand how linguists establish that languages are related, because the process is far more rigorous than most people assume. It is not about finding words that sound similar. That method is worthless, and every linguist will tell you so. In any two languages on Earth, chosen at random, you can find a handful of words that resemble each other by pure coincidence. With tens of thousands of words in each language, accidental matches are guaranteed. What actually establishes relationship is systematic correspondence. When two languages descend from a common ancestor, the sound changes that occurred as they diverged happened according to regular patterns, not word by word, but across the entire vocabulary. If a particular sound in one language corresponds to a particular sound in another, that correspondence should show up consistently, in dozens or hundreds of words, in the core vocabulary that languages rarely borrow: numbers, body parts, kinship terms, basic verbs. That is how we know English and Hindi are distant relatives despite sounding nothing alike. That is how the Indo-European family was reconstructed. And that is the standard Zuni has failed to meet against every language it has been compared to. Linguists have tried linking it to the Penutian languages of California. They have tried Hokan. They have tried Tanoan and Karasan, its immediate Pueblo neighbors. Some proposals have gathered a bit of support and then failed under scrutiny. Others were dismissed quickly. The overall pattern is consistent. Zuni does not systematically correspond with anything. Which brings us to the important question: what does that actually mean? The mainstream answer, and the one most linguists hold, is essentially about survival odds. Language families die. Over the last several thousand years, an enormous number of languages have disappeared entirely, through population collapse, through assimilation, through conquest, through the ordinary process of communities shifting to a neighbor's language over a few generations. When a family loses all its members but one, the survivor becomes an isolate by default. It is not mysterious. It is a statistical outcome, and North America has been especially hard hit. Language loss on this continent since European contact has been catastrophic. Many languages went extinct before anyone documented them. Whole families may have vanished, leaving no record at all. A language that looks unrelated to everything might have had relatives who died without ever being written down. So the honest baseline is this: Zuni being an isolate does not, by itself, require any exotic explanation. It is unusual, but it sits comfortably within the range of things that happen to languages. Nancy Yaw Davis knew all of that. Her argument was not that the isolate status alone proved anything. It was that when you looked at the Zuni situation as a whole, the language, plus several other things, a specific pattern emerged that she thought demanded a specific explanation. Before we continue, if you enjoyed documentaries that examine forgotten history through linguistics, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep researching investigations like this one, because her argument didn't start with the language at all. It started with a coincidence in a dentist's office. Nancy Yaw Davis was a trained anthropologist with a doctorate who had done extensive fieldwork in Alaska. She was not an outsider to the discipline, and this is worth stating clearly because it separates her from the enormous volume of amateur speculation that surrounds this topic. Her interest in the Zuni began by her own account with a striking observation about dental characteristics, a category of evidence physical anthropologists take seriously because tooth shape is strongly heritable and varies in patterned ways between populations. Certain dental traits are notably common in East Asian populations and notably rarer elsewhere. Davis became interested in reports of unusual dental patterns among the Zuni compared to neighboring populations. From there, she began assembling a wider case, and she spent years on it. Her book, published in 2000, laid out several categories of evidence. The first was linguistic. Davis compiled lists of Zuni and Japanese words that she argued shared both sound and meaning, and pointed to features of Zuni grammar she considered more similar to Japanese than to neighboring American languages. The second was biological. Beyond the dental traits, she pointed to reported patterns in blood type distribution among the Zuni that she considered anomalous for the region, and to reports of a particular kidney disease occurring at rates she argued were unusual and worth investigating. The third was cultural and religious. Davis pointed to elements of Zuni ceremonial life, certain symbolic and organizational features, and aspects of their material culture that she considered to have parallels in Japanese Buddhist tradition of the relevant period. The fourth was archaeological and chronological, and it is the part of her argument that connects to a genuine live debate in southwestern archaeology, which we'll come to in a moment. Her reconstruction went like this. In the late 1200s, a group of Japanese Buddhist pilgrims, she suggested motivated by a search for a sacred place in a period of upheaval in Japan, crossed the Pacific. They landed on the California coast, traveled inland, and eventually arrived in the southwest where they encountered and merged with existing populations. The result was the Zuni, a people with a language, a genetic profile, and a religious tradition that differed from their neighbors because a genuinely foreign population had joined them. That is the claim. Now let's examine how it holds up, because being honest about this is more interesting than either cheerleading for it or dismissing it out of hand. The scholarly response to Davis's book was, to be blunt, not favorable, and the criticisms are substantive. Start with the linguistic evidence, because that's the heart of it. Word lists comparing two unrelated languages will always produce apparent matches. This is not a minor caveat. It is the central methodological problem in all long-distance language comparison. And it is precisely why the discipline developed the regular correspondence standard in the first place. To demonstrate that Zuni and Japanese are related, you would need systematic sound correspondences appearing consistently across core vocabulary, reconstructible back to a shared ancestral form. That has not been demonstrated. Linguists examining Davis's comparisons have generally concluded that the resemblances fall within the range of chance, and that the grammatical parallels she cites are features found in many unrelated languages worldwide rather than shared inheritance. There is also a chronological problem specific to her scenario. If Japanese speakers arrived in the 13th century and their language contributed to Zuni, we would expect the relationship to be relatively recent and therefore relatively visible. Recent contact leaves clearer traces than ancient divergence. Instead, the proposed connections are faint and irregular. That is the opposite of what the scenario predicts. The biological evidence has similar issues. Dental and blood group traits vary considerably between populations, including between neighboring Native American communities, without requiring transoceanic contact to explain the variation. And crucially, the strongest available test, genetics, has not supported the hypothesis. Broad genomic studies of indigenous American populations have consistently found ancestry patterns consistent with the peopling of the Americas from Northeast Asia in the deep past, tens of thousands of years ago, rather than a distinct medieval Japanese contribution to a specific pueblo. A 13th century population merger of the size Davis proposed should leave a detectable signal. It has not been found. The cultural parallels face the most familiar objection of all. Parallels are easy to find between any two religious traditions if you go looking. Rosette patterns, sacred lakes, ritual organizations, symbolic numbers. These recur across human cultures independently, without a chain of transmission demonstrated by other evidence. Resemblance alone doesn't establish contact. And then there's a broader point that deserves stating directly, because it connects this story to the last several investigations we've done on this channel. There is a very long tradition in American thought of explaining indigenous achievements by importing outsiders. The mound builders were supposedly Phoenicians, the copper mines were supposedly Egyptians. The Cherokees' stone walls were supposedly Welsh. Over and over, when European Americans encountered something impressive, the explanation reached for was, someone else must have done this. Davis's proposal is far more careful and far better credentialed than any of those, and it is not motivated by that tradition. But it lands in the same shape, and the Zuni themselves have not generally embraced it. Their own origin traditions describe emergence and migration to their present location, a history rooted in this land, not an arrival from across an ocean. So on the evidence as it stands, the Japanese contact hypothesis does not hold up. And this is where it gets interesting. The fact that Davis's answer appears to be wrong does not mean the question she was circling doesn't exist. Here is what is genuinely unresolved, and it has nothing to do with Japan. The late 1200s in the American Southwest were a period of extraordinary upheaval. This is not speculation. It is one of the most thoroughly documented transformations in North American archaeology. Across the Four Corners region, the large ancestral Puebloan communities, including the famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, were depopulated within a remarkably short span. People left. Entire regions that had supported substantial populations for centuries emptied out. The timing centers on the late 13th century, and archaeologists have spent decades working on why. The causes proposed include a severe prolonged drought, documented in tree ring records, environmental degradation, and evidence of violence and social breakdown during that period. Most researchers now favor a combination of factors, rather than any single cause. What is far less settled is the destination question. Where did all those people go, and how did the movements reshape the communities that received them? The broad answer is that they moved south and east into the Rio Grande Valley and into the regions where the historic pueblos are located today. Modern Pueblo peoples are their descendants. This is well established through archaeology, oral tradition, and continuity of material culture. But the fine-grained picture is complicated. Populations mixed, communities absorbed newcomers. Ceremonial systems were reorganized, sometimes dramatically. The emergence of certain widespread religious traditions in the Southwest appears to date to roughly this period of upheaval and reconstitution. Languages came into contact, and Zuni sits right in the middle of that turbulence, both geographically and chronologically. So consider a much less exotic possibility, one that requires no ocean crossing at all. If Zuni's ancestors were one community among many, in a region where language diversity was higher than it is today, a region that then experienced population collapse, mass migration, and the disappearance of numerous communities, then the survival of a single unrelated language, whose relatives died in the upheaval, is not merely possible. It is close to what you would expect. Under that reading, Zuni's isolation is not evidence of foreign arrival. It is evidence of local catastrophe. The language is a survivor of something, and the something is not a Pacific crossing. It is the 13th century in the Southwest. That version has considerably less romance to it. Also fits everything we actually know. And there's a further point worth making, which the Zuni have made themselves. A great deal of what Davis treated as evidence of foreign influence, distinctive ceremonial organization, specific religious traditions, particular symbolic systems, is better understood as evidence of a distinctive local history. The Zuni are not unusual because someone else made them unusual. They are unusual because their own history was unusual. So what is left once you strip away the transoceanic voyage? A language that has no demonstrated relatives, spoken today by several thousand people in western New Mexico and taught to a new generation in a community that has worked hard to keep it alive. A region that experienced one of the most dramatic population upheavals in the pre-contact history of North America, the full details of which are still being reconstructed. An open question about how many languages were spoken in the Southwest before that upheaval, and how many disappeared without ever being recorded, a question that by its nature may never be fully answerable. And a hypothesis, published by a credentialed anthropologist after years of work, which the evidence does not support, but which drew attention to something real, that the standard account of what happened in the Southwest in the 13th century has genuine gaps in it, and that Zuni is one of the places where those gaps are visible. That, I think, is the honest conclusion. Not a lost voyage, not a hidden connection across the Pacific. Something quieter and in its own way, more sobering. We are looking at the linguistic wreckage of a catastrophe. Zuni is what remains when everything a language was related to has been erased by drought, by violence, by migration, by the slow disappearance of communities whose names we do not have and whose words nobody wrote down. The mystery of Zuni is not where it came from. It is what else was here, and how much of it we lost before anyone thought to listen. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that trace forgotten history through linguistics, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge, consider subscribing. There are more investigations like this on the way. And before you go, I want to hear your thoughts. How many languages do you think were spoken in North America before European contact that we have no record of at all? And do you think we'll ever find a way to detect them through archaeology, through genetics, through traces left in the languages that survived? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.